Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 18th of August, 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. We will be joined by live video Skype link by Mark Anderson from American Free Press. Well, the weather's pretty good here in Plymouth. We've got some nice reports coming in from across the country. Even Scotland's dry, warm and clammy. Apparently, it's lovely in Rhondda. A little bit overcast, I think, in Manchester, but generally people should be enjoying a nice day. We'll soon put a stop to that.
Indeed.
Well, where can we start? Well, of course, the last people to be informed of anything really are the British public. We are well beneath our leading politicians, future leaders. And really, to find out what's going on, we have to pick up snippets of information from other sources. So we'd like to thank Alex Thompson here for tweeting out this letter, which is between the Northern Ireland executive and our illustrious leader, Theresa May. What are we interested in? Well, let's sort of blow it up a bit. And it says, since our meeting, we've noted your stated intent to trigger Article 50 early in 2017. And Alex was making the point here that it's very nice of Theresa May to be telling the rest of us, but apparently your team, Mike, are well ahead of the game.
My team.
And the interesting thing is here, the Northern Irish executive goes on to say, firstly and most obviously, this region, you're a region, is unique in that it's the only part of the UK which has a land border with an EU member state. So everybody's suddenly getting squeamish about the borders with the European Union now. But the key point is nice of the government to just let the rest of us know when they're going to trigger Article 50.
I'll still believe it when I see it.
Indeed.
Yes.
Well,
let's bring Mark in at this point. Mark, this article you published back in June, but you've updated it again. Brexit, a one-way ticket to Atlanticism. This possibly is hinting at some things that we were saying before the referendum result was out. That actually it didn't matter which way the result went or whether we were in or out of Europe, because there's a bigger agenda at work here.
Correct. I did this update on my blog, thetruthhound.com, recently to point out the fact. I believe it's a fact. And all the arrows have been pointing this direction for quite some time, since long before the Brexit vote, that the larger structures that are being formed through the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP treaty, and the long-time alliances, not just the British alliance with the new European Union Army, that's bad enough, but we have this TTIP treaty and this large structure that would involve the European Union, the UK, and the US. And this has been going on for quite some time through the think tanks in Washington, D.C. and whatnot. And Atlanticism, as expressed by the Atlantic Council, which is one of these think tanks in Washington, Atlanticism is this idea of this large political and economic construct that has been envisioned really since Bretton Woods, the economic conference in New Hampshire that happened in the waning days of World War II, when they formed the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. And of course, Bilderberg grew up in the soils of Bretton Woods. And so we're seeing a long-term strategy. This has been on the back burner. It's been moved to the front burner. So Brexit, as I did this update, I'm seeing it really as one step back, but two or more steps forward for the one world controllers. And so Brexit, as you've said, Mike, whether it succeeds or not, whether they ever initiate Article 50 remains to be seen. To this day, Britain is still very much a member of the European Union and will remain so for the foreseeable future. But whatever happens with Brexit, it's a divorce that may never be finalized. The Atlanticism, the idea of an Atlantica, there's been all these kind of esoteric names that have been put out there, and so Brexit, is it a sideshow? Will it ever happen? Who knows? But what they really want is the TTIP treaty and these larger structures. And that's what I pointed out in this update.
Absolutely. And one of the larger structures that we have been trying to highlight over the last number of years, of course, is the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is mostly forgotten because it's considered to be something which is coming out of the Empire days.
Yeah,
historical thing. It's really not that important. But actually, they've been working very hard on the Commonwealth over the last few years. This is the event details on the right-hand side of that slide there, ignore. What we're talking about today is the 6th Biennial Commonwealth Ministers of Public Service Forum, which was held yesterday in Malaysia. It was held under the theme of Governance for Sustainable Development, supporting the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this is the Commonwealth absolutely pushing forward the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this forum brought together ministers, heads of public service, and other public officials from Commonwealth countries to discuss the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The point that they make is that the World Bank estimates that bribes cost the economy about $1 trillion last year, and that corruption a further $3 trillion. And so they're saying that there is a funding shortfall of about $2.5 trillion to meet the Millennium Development Goals. Baroness Scotland, Patricia Scotland, who is the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, was giving a speech. So let's have a look at some of the things that she said. She said, a vital need in many of our Commonwealth member states at all levels of government is to create agile public institutions that are efficient, effective and accountable. And what we're talking about here is carrying on the theme that we were discussing yesterday. What she is talking about is changing how people are governed. This is about changing the relationship between individuals and the state. And she said that this requires greater public transparency with democratic oversight and institutional responsiveness in all aspects of public procurement, public financial management, rigorous provision of enforcement of anti-corruption measures. And this is very similar to the type of agenda that we've seen in this country over the last couple of years: transparency, anti-corruption. And of course, as we were highlighting this week, what transparency absolutely represents is the provision of big data for corporations. And it's got nothing to do with accountability or giving people the ability to see what government is actually up to. So let's have a look and see what else she said. She said, we are now facing common challenges for which we need common solutions. Could that be a common purpose, Brian?
I think highly likely.
Indeed. And so she has launched a new research study called Key Principles of Public Sector Reform, Case Studies and Frameworks. And that's going to offer case studies in public sector reforms in more than a dozen countries. Now, we were talking about public sector reforms in this country a day or two ago.
Well, it's obvious that the aim is to fully corporatise those public services, Mike. That's coming in very quickly. We've got amalgamation of local authority areas, and now we've got local authorities setting up commercial companies. Cornwall County Council, for example, says it's going to repair the roads in Nottingham for profit.
So we are seeing this corporatisation, this privatisation agenda now attempted to be rolled out right across the Commonwealth. And to put this in perspective, the Commonwealth is a third of the population of the planet. Well, she went on to say that governments should adopt new and creative ways of governing in order to overcome concerns such as climate change and slow economic growth. So the problems that they've created, they are using as the excuse for driving through new and creative ways of governing. And of course, these new and creative ways of governing are not positive developments for individuals. We asked, is Baroness Scotland Common Purpose? Well, here she is on the Common Purpose website, asking people to get involved in the 3360 leadership training program. And of course, we've got to remember also the other Common Purpose leadership training program, which is CSC Leaders, which is the Commonwealth Study Conference leadership program run by Common Purpose, established by the Duke of Edinburgh, and currently having Princess Anne, that's right, Princess Anne as its patron. So
right.
There you go. royalty right at the heart of this.
And we've also, of course, just reported on the fact that we've got super diversity unfolding in New Zealand, where the aim is to move towards greater diversity, particularly in cities. Auckland to be chosen as a guinea pig city for this type of agenda, and who is working hand in glove with the Auckland authorities and the super diversity team. But of course, Julia Middleton, Chief Executive of political charity Common Purpose. So they're really going for global common purpose now. Never mind what's been done to wreck the civil service in UK. Common Purpose is now on to world government control.
And Mark, it seems that with increasing exposure of Bilderberg, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, and these types of organisations, they just simply move their agenda into another sort of globalist body and continue as if nothing's
chameleon.
Yeah.
That's correct. I think we might be getting a slight technical glitch here, but yeah, it runs hand in hand with Bilderberg in the sense of all the privatization, hence Bilderberg always involving large private corporate leaders, as well as government leaders who break bread together along with the high-tech gurus. It's all about privatization and consolidation of the world along technological, scientific, political, economic, and other lines. And the PC thing is always an underlying part of that, this diversity shimmeloth. It's such a sham, and yet there it is.
Yes. Okay, next we're going to be talking about Hillary Clinton, Mark. But before I do, I just wanted to highlight what's in the sidebar of your American Free Press here. Victor Thorn, I'm sorry to hear about his passing. He's been around for many, many years.
That's true. I didn't know Victor real well. I knew him reasonably well. It's still a little bit of a mystery in the sense that there's still information to gather. But it appears that he actually planned his own demise, I guess you'd say, due to personal reasons. He lived life on his own terms and was disturbed by the concept of growing old, things like this. Just kind of a quirk of his personality, his viewpoint, his philosophical view, I guess you'd say. I don't have all the intel on it, but he apparently willfully took his own life. This is what his family has told American Free Press, and it happened on August 1st in Pennsylvania, where he lived. And he did a lot of research on 9/11, but particularly on the Clintons. He wrote a trilogy on the Clintons that's available at First Amendment Books through the AmericanFreePress.net website. And that trilogy is a good read, covering the many, many crimes and scandals of the Clintons. That's what Victor was best known for, and we'll remember him well. He was a good guy, and may he rest in peace.
Yes, indeed. Couldn't say that better myself. But tell us about this Secret Service agent, who's revealing Hillary's secrets. She's attempting to prevent this being released.
Yes, Dave Gahary of American Free Press got a sit-down interview. I think we're the only newspaper to directly interview him, and this was just published in our most recent edition of American Free Press, again available at AmericanFreePress.net, as is Gary J. Burns' book, also available through AmericanFreePress.net. And that's through First Amendment Books, which is an arm of AFP. Gary J. Byrne was a Secret Service agent right during the Clinton administration when your friend and mine, Bill Clinton, was president of the United States after he had been tapped by Bilderberg in Germany in 1991. And he talked about the personal squabbles, scandals, crimes, across the whole gamut, really. He was one of the ones that was stationed right outside the door of Bill Clinton's Oval Office for a time. And the behavior and scandals and crimes and misdemeanors of the Clintons are so legion, they run such a wide range that it's literally mind-boggling. But even more mind-boggling are the efforts of the Clinton campaign right now, as she's the Democratic nominee for president, the efforts to squash that book. Only Fox News has given Gary J. Byrne reasonable time on TV, and no newspapers other than American Free Press of any import that I know of have interviewed him or written about him. All the other TV networks, apparently at the behest of Hillary Clinton to some degree, have completely put the kibosh on mentioning his book other than to criticize it. So this is the one book, because of the stature of Gary J. Byrne, because of where he was, because of his credibility. This is the one book, along with Victor's trilogy, especially that combined, that could really put a dent in Hillary Clinton's campaign, which would really be a welcome thing given her behavior and very convincing reports of her declining health, mentally, physically, and otherwise. It's a very disturbing situation.
So one of the things I wanted to get your thoughts on, just briefly, Mark, if we could, is how much of this health business is, because I mean, there's lots, as you've said, to criticize Hillary about. There's a string of bodies lying across America. There's the email scandal. There's Benghazi. But how much of the health situation do you think is genuine, and how much is being driven by the Trump campaigners?
Based on what I've seen, I think this is just my opinion. I've watched several credible, believable videos about Hillary's situation, about her mental state or physical state. Trump, of course, is bringing it up, and yeah, he's trying to make some hay out of it. You can't blame him for that. That's how it works. Politics is a blood sport, let's face it. But I think it's largely real that he's gaining weight and having trouble walking upstairs. But there are a couple of very good YouTube videos that showcase very errant, very bizarre behavior that likened to a seizure, very serious physical twitches, very serious contortions in her face and in her neck, very wide-eyed, holding her mouth unusually wide open, overreacting to stimuli, being surrounded by a group of reporters, and whenever she's questioned by more than one reporter, she goes into kind of a meltdown mode. And it shows reporters on these videos reacting to her like, "What is up with you?" I think that maybe the load of the campaign, the challenge of running for president, the scandals perhaps catching up with her, I think it's all beginning to weigh very heavily on her. But I think the main thing to point out here is that even though JFK had back problems and some health problems of a various nature going into the presidency, in fact, well before the presidency when he was in the Congress, even though JFK had those problems, they didn't affect his intellectual flow too much, if you know what I mean. He was able to govern and be a logical and intelligent person. Roosevelt had a degenerative disease that eventually put him in the wheelchair, as we all know about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But Hillary, it's a whole comprehensive thing, mental, physical, and really, in a way, spiritual, if you will. This is very disturbing because she appears really like she's losing her grip across the board, and this is very serious. It makes you wonder why someone, especially combined with all these scandals, would even be allowed to run anymore. I think there's a point where someone has to be required by law to simply pull out.
Yeah.
Mark, I just wanted to say I found it interesting that aside from the professional medical comment on Hillary Clinton's health, the Russian Orthodox Church had also said, well, if we look at this lady, there's something incredibly dark operating through her, and they also said, "Well, just look at what she's been involved in."
Yes, without going too far into the spiritual realm or the more unseen hand in the world we live in, it certainly appears that Hillary is suffering from a spiritual, mental, and physical, wide-ranging set of disturbances. It's hard to describe. I'm kind of struggling with the words here kind of early in the morning here in Texas. But it's very disturbing and unsettling that someone of that mindset would have the media still covering up for her and actually talking more about Trump being mean-spirited and, again, that he hates women. He hates all things. He hates women. He hates apple pie. He hates little bluebirds, and he hates the sky. And, this is what we're getting mostly from the media, that, Donald Trump's just a hater, and how dare he bring her health up. But the media is covering up for her like they did for FDR, like they did for JFK to a point. But Hillary's problems are so much more serious and obvious that the cover-up is that much more inexcusable.
Yes. Okay. So next we've got another article from the Truth Hound here. Tell us about Mark Ryan?
Oh, Paul Ryan is
Paul Ryan. Sorry. Yes.
Oh, that's okay. He's the Speaker of the House. He's a congressman from Wisconsin in the 1st District.
Oh, he's taken over from Mr. Boehner.
Yeah, some time ago, Boehner stepped down, not long after Pope Francis visited Washington. And we won't go into why that happened, but Paul Ryan is a typical neoconservative, pseudo-conservative, counterfeit conservative, as I point out here. And I show the picture of the novelist Ayn Rand behind him because he's rather a disciple of that pseudo-capitalist novelist and author that we're all pretty much familiar with. And what I'm pointing out here is Paul Ryan is part of this coterie of congressmen that keep the backbenchers out, that keep the rebels at bay. He himself won his re-election because he did have an insurgent challenger running against him, a water technician, anti-war Republican named Paul Nealon. Unfortunately, Mr. Nealon was not able to unseat Mr. Ryan, but Mr. Ryan is simply emblematic of this clique within the U.S. Congress that has convinced people that being conservative and being Republican can only mean being pro-war. It can only mean being pro-monopoly capitalist. It can only mean betraying the U.S. Constitution and working on the world structures like the TTIP and like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it also means that rebel Republicans that are already in Congress, that have gotten in there, are being edged out. One of them, not so much a rebel, but a little bit, was Tim Huelskamp, a congressman from Kansas. He was forced out. He lost his primary. They targeted him. So they got rid of one rebel Republican that doesn't always go along with this establishment agenda. Now they're looking at people like Walter Jones of North Carolina, Justin Amash of Michigan. These are what you'd call in England the backbenchers. They're the anti-war Republicans, largely at least to a reasonable extent, anti-monopoly capitalists, very much anti-surveillance, while the Paul Ryans of the world are pro-surveillance, pro-police state. This is a trend in Congress, and the main point, the overall point is we can't just talk about Hillary and Trump. We've got to talk about who's getting into the Congress. The president is not the only election around, so that's why I put this on my blog, thetruthhound.com, and this is the dynamic going on while we're all obsessed with Hillary and Trump, is that the relatively few good congressmen are being forced out, and the good guys that try and get in are having a very hard time getting in. And this is going on behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the vast majority of people that are obsessed with the presidency.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for that.
Mark, well, you've raised some really interesting points. I'll just pick up on the fact that you've said that some of the media is trying to pin Trump as anti-women, if I remember correctly, anti-bluebird and anti-blue sky. Well, if that's what's happening in the States, just have a look at this for what's going on in the UK. According to the BBC, for somebody to be a leader of one of the major parties, in this case we're talking Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, the BBC thinks that they should be informed about Ant and Dec. Now, I've got to admit live on air that Mike Robinson has told me off about this particular slide because, of course, I had to admit that I knew about Ant and Dec. They are unbelievably childish, puerile, so-called comedians. Is that the right word?
No, the presenters.
Presenters. Yes. Well, I can't really tell. But according to the BBC, you're only suitable to become leader of a political party and probably the Prime Minister if you're aware of these two puerile presenters. So we can see this unbelievable media and press spin working both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, if we follow the links through, well, the BBC's a law unto itself worldwide, particularly with Commonwealth audiences. But if we look at the corporate side, we see the same control of this media, whether it's in America or UK. But we can see what they're trying to do.
Yes.
Then BBC not interested in bloodshed, though, Mike, luckily.
Well, of course, those comments were made at the hustings, the debate between Jeremy Corbyn and his counterpart, Owen Smith, for the leadership. But Owen Smith did say one thing that was quite interesting, among many things that weren't. He suggested that ISIS should be involved in the Syrian peace process, and that we should be speaking to them because all conflicts end up with negotiation at some point. But he did say, of course, that ISIS would need to give up their violence in the meantime. But you've got to question the judgment of somebody who thinks that it's good to negotiate with people that cut the heads off children.
Yeah, well, I mean, politicians now are just very happy to deal with whoever, Mike. It's and Syria, as we're going to see, we've got a little bit more on Syria. It's getting more interesting to see what the feeling is amongst Conservatives.
Yes. Okay. Homelessness. This is the Communities and Local Government Select Committee have produced a report. 30% rise in homelessness 2014 to 2015. That's 3,569 people. A quarter of those were sleeping on the streets in London. But those figures do not include the so-called hidden homeless, as the report says, who are people that didn't come forward to be registered. So that's probably an even bigger figure, because I would imagine quite a lot of people that are homeless aren't interested in registering for these kinds of things. The Labour MP Clive Betts, who's the chairman of the committee, said that the scale of homelessness is now such that a renewed government strategy is a must. But the key point is that they were pointing out that it was the impact of welfare reforms, i.e. austerity, since 2010, which is the main cause of the problem. Now, what they're doing is that they've put in a private member's bill, a homelessness reduction bill, and that's being supported by the committee. It remains to be seen whether it be supported by government. And then what they intend to do is, they've made some points about the impact of welfare reforms, that the Secretary of State should write to all local authorities and reiterate their duties when placing families outside their areas. It's really not terribly satisfactory, the solutions that they have. There aren't really any. But it was just interesting, I thought, and it should be highlighted that austerity was having such a major impact.
So nobody knows what the immigration figures are at the moment, Mike. Nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to talk about the politicians who've created this huge movement of people. But the politicians are surprised they got nowhere to live, and many aren't declaring themselves. Well, perhaps we can bring in our local Conservative, Gary Streeter. Here he is. Actually, this is a bit of a flattering photograph, I've got to say, by the Express. Because
it's a bit old.
Yeah, he looks a little bit, whatever the word is, young, I think. But what's he had to say? Well, Mr. Streeter has said that travellers are intruders like Genghis Khan, and their status as vulnerable ethnic minorities should be removed. He also thinks that most of them earn more than MPs. This is a man who lives in a mini castle, a former farmhouse in good ground. So he's got his little Englishman's castle. The problem seems to be that there's plans for a traveller's site, I think a little bit too close. And so he's now come up with what I think is a pretty vicious statement. It's a smiling face of conservative Christianity because, of course, let's remember that Gary Streeter is the chairman of the Conservative Christians in Parliament organisation.
It's got to be an oxymoron.
This is a huge oxymoron. In my opinion, this man is not a Christian in any shape or form. You can tell by what comes out of his mouth and his deeds. But here is here's the front page of the website for Christians in Parliament, and there arrowed is Mr. Streeter, chairman. I thought you might be interested, Mike, a friend of yours, Mr. Farron here, vice chair. Mr. Farron being the man, of course, who refused to answer any questions on how he was going to protect Syrian children.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, there they are. But we just, what's the organisation about? It says Christians in Parliament is an all-party parliamentary group that exist to support Christians of all denominations and parties in their work in the Houses of Parliament. You can imagine these people, they've got love and compassion at their very core. But we were a little bit concerned to see that they're advertising this lady, and I think I'm correct in saying it's actually our old friend Harriet Harman. And so let's just remember that, of course, it was Harriet Harman and her husband Jack Dromey who were linked through to the organisation Liberty, National Council of Civil Liberties as it was. And at that time, of course, it was linked into the paedophile information exchange. So a little bit worrying that we've got the Christian organisation for Parliament quite happy to be promoting somebody who seems to have some pretty mucky links. And as I've just said, of course, Mr. Farron does not want to talk about missing Syrian children. Well, if we actually have a look at Mr. Streeter properly, this is more what he looks like. And why are we interested? Well, because this is the MP that supported Brooks Newmark MP over terrorist links. And you'll remember that it was exclusively the UK column that highlighted Brooks Newmark made claims publicly that Assad had used chemical weapons. At the time, there was absolutely no evidence to back this up. We challenged him. He couldn't come up with a decent response. But he also said that he was very embarrassed because he'd promised General Idris of the Free Syrian Army that bombs and missiles would soon be raining down on Assad. That didn't get through Parliament, and he was very upset. He also was happy to point out the links between the Free Syrian Army and al-Nusra. And of course, as we know, they are terrorists and nasty people. So not sure of the connections. But let's have a look at Brooks Newmark as he stars in his birthday suit. This was a little bit of muckiness going over social media with a young lady. And of course, not only did Gary Streeter defend this man, he took no action on Newmark's false claims of chemical weapons, but Christian Gary Streeter was very, very keen to get the bombing going in Syria. The hypocrisy of this man is unbelievable. Are we unique in having such fine politicians, Mark, or do you think that you've got a few to match Mr. Streeter in the States?
Indeed, we can match it, gentlemen. This reminds me pretty much of people like Lindsey Graham, who was an early presidential candidate.
Sorry, Sorry, that's better. We didn't have you on screen, so start again. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, that's quite all right. Yes, we do have a parallel here, such as Lindsey Graham, the early presidential candidate in the 2016 cycle, who has been a darling of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's a Republican from South Carolina. He's a bomb Iran, bomb Syria, bomb everything Republican, so-called Christian conservative, just like Mr. Streeter. Another would be another recent presidential candidate who bowed out here, Senator Ted Cruz, a Republican from here in Texas, another Christian conservative that wants to rain down bombs on distant countries that they know nothing about while they peddle the propaganda that keeps the war machine going. So we have, as I was discussing earlier on today's show, the Paul Ryans of the world. You have these pseudo-conservatives, these counterfeit constitutionalists that pose themselves as Christians, but do very anti-Christian things in their public policy. So it's alive and well here, and they're the ones that want to keep these rebels from both parties, or especially third parties and independents, out of the White House, out of the Congress, and if they're already in, they want to push them out or not let them in the first place. So yes, we very much have that parallel here.
Okay, thank you for that. And just an ending comment on Syria. It's been really fantastic to see that the good work carried out by Vanessa Beeley in exposing the white helmets, and of course Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire, Mike here from UK Column have been on that case. But this is now starting to circulate over social media and through Westminster. So if we can just bring this slide up on the screen, we can see what's being tweeted through Syria's white helmets, NATO's shadow state project blueprint. And that's gone to some interesting members of Parliament. So I think the word is beginning to spread, Mike.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is fantastic, and of course, social media um, is going to feature a little bit more in a second. But social media being used as a major source of intelligence by the intelligence services. So the more people push this kind of
Factual
stuff out,
stuff.
factual stuff out on that, the more the powers that be, if you want to call them that, will start to get nervous. But of course, Syria not the only conflict, and Yemen still not getting the coverage that it deserves, really. But nonetheless, the New York Times here mentioning yet another airstrike in Yemen, killing 17, mostly women and children. They're saying that eyewitnesses have described it as what they're calling a double tap strike. So, in other words, the place was bombed, and then rescuers went to help, and then it was bombed again, and so the rescuers killed as well. Saudi, of course, is the country that's doing this. They say they're only striking military targets. They accuse the Houthis of using civilians as shields, if you like, and so it goes on. But I just wanted to contrast what is the fact on the ground, uh, civilians being killed, with what Boris Johnson said. We mentioned this on Monday. I'm seriously concerned about the actions being taken by elements of the Houthis, the General People's Congress, and allies in defiance of the Yemeni constitution and the UN process. Encourage all parties not to take action that undermines the possibility of peace. No mention, no criticism of Saudi Arabia from our Foreign Secretary, of course. Uh, they continue to murder with impunity, and nothing really from Britain
Well, these
or the
people,
United States.
these people, British politicians, particularly the senior politicians, as it were, simply don't have consciences, Mike. They will do whatever they think from minute to minute, which is going to get them the best advantage. They think of themselves. There is no compassion, so we shouldn't be surprised, should we?
No, indeed. Okay, so this next one is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they've produced a report called "Healing a Divided Britain: The Need for a Comprehensive Race Equality Strategy." And I'm going to say that this has to be seen in the context of what's going on in the United States with Black Lives Matter. We've seen similar types of campaigns going on in the UK. I believe that the Black Lives Matter uh, term has been brought over to the UK. But this is really saying that ethnic minorities, particularly black minorities, are facing entrenched racial inequality. It's being called entrenched, and they're saying that black graduates earn, for example, 23.1% less than white graduates. And they go on to give various statistics. The quote from David Isaac, the chairman of the HRC, is saying the combination of the post-Brexit rise in hate crime and deep race inequality in Britain is very worrying and must be tackled urgently. Today's report underlines how entrenched race inequality and unfairness still is in our society. And really, what I'm asking here is, I'm questioning the timing of this. Nothing really has changed. We haven't suddenly seen a change in race relations in the last couple of weeks since the Brexit vote, Brian. So why is this being timed now? It seems to be coincidental with what's going on in the US, and just more effort to break up communities and break people apart.
Well, I think that's the key statement, Mike. Any time they claim to be doing good, you can be sure the objective is the opposite. So in healing a divided Britain, the message really is we're going to pump out information which is going to help stir up hate and angst and divide the nation even further. And of course, it's solely the UK column that warned about the penetration of political charity common purpose, or the attempted penetration of common purpose into the Muslim communities, which was clearly targeted to just help break them up. So look at the message given out, turn it 180 degrees, and you're usually somewhere close to the truth.
So I thought I would have a look and see who David Isaac is. He's the chair of that organisation, but he's also a barrister. He's a partner and head of the advanced manufacturing technology sector for Pinsent Mason, the law firm. So I'm not quite sure what being a specialist in advanced manufacturing and technology law brings to the table with regard to minority rights. And
it's interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
Fascinating.
But let's just run through his CV here. He's independently recognised for his wealth of knowledge and experience, according to the government. He leads teams of lawyers on major projects for the Transport for London for the BBC. He was appointed as chairman of the ECHR on the 26th of April this year by Nicky Morgan, and he took up the role formally on the 10th of May. He's chair of modern art at Oxford.
Handy.
A director of the big lottery fund in the past, and he's also been involved in driving diversity in the City of London. So this is the man who's pushing forward this agenda. But by coincidence, none other than Demos has also produced a report today, and this is about Islamophobia on Twitter. And what they're saying is that new online big data research by the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at the Demos think tank has found significant spikes in the use of anti-Islamic language on Twitter in the immediate aftermath of news events, particularly terrorist attacks. And they list the 15th of July following Nice, the 8th of July following the shooting of police officers in Dallas in the United States, the 17th of July after the attempted coup in Turkey, the 5th of July on the end of Ramadan, and 4 days after a siege at a cafe in Bangladesh, and so on. And I just want to ask the question, Brian, what happens if these events were not terrorist events, but were in fact state-sponsored?
Well, we've got propaganda and rhetoric here to stir up hatred, but
so the key point here isn't it that we've got a behavioural insights team, which is using big data, and we've got Demos using big data. They're using Twitter and Facebook as the gauge for people's reaction. They create news stories, they place the news stories, or they create a state-sponsored terrorist event, for example, and then they use their big data technology to gauge public reaction to it. And then after a period of time, they can work out how to actually create the reaction that they want based on stories in the media. And I just would say that I suggest, therefore, and people can query this, but I suggest people do some research. I suggest, therefore, that this report on the situation with ethnic minorities in this country should be seen in that context.
Yeah, and should be regarded very cynically as an attempt to do the opposite to what it says. And of course, the moment we see Demos, we've got to remember common purpose. The two are intimately linked. We've also got to remember Jeff Mulgan, who worked at the heart of government pushing common purpose policy. So we've got common purpose pushing diversity, but wherever they do that, we seem to get trouble. And now we've got these other organisations coming along trying to advise people how to cope with all this.
Mark, could you comment?
Oh, absolutely. Isn't it interesting how people, the average person in America and Britain, especially in you guys' country, the populace is accused of Islamophobia. There's this breakneck immigration, this migration going on, caused by the Western nations, NATO, the UK, the US, with some connivance by Israel to attack these Arab countries and Northern African countries, driving these people into Europe. The Islamophobes are the ones that are killing the Arabs. The Islamophobes are the Western military forces and their foreign policy gurus. They're the haters. They're the Islamophobes. And that has to be stressed. And I mentioned earlier through our email correspondence that Operation Gladio by NATO appears to have a parallel in ISIS. And people can go on the AmericanFreePress.net website and find an article by Paul Craig Roberts, a former Treasury official here. We're one of the few hard copy newspapers that carries Roberts' column. And he writes about the parallels with Operation Gladio, where attacks were deliberately staged, such as the recent French attack involving that semi. Attacks are deliberately staged. In the old days, under Operation Gladio, they were staged to discredit and bring infamy on the leftward movement of the European governments at that time, because they were leaning toward the communists in the Soviet Union. So attacks were staged. Train stations were blown up through NATO operatives in Operation Gladio. And now, can we ask the question, is ISIS a modern parallel of Operation Gladio, where once again bombings are staged, such as in Brussels, and it's used to discredit and bring more doom and gloom upon the Arab community, upon Islam? And so there's lots of machinations going on. People can read about it on their own, but I think this is very deep, and I think it's just extremely cynical and just outright hateful to accuse everybody of Islamophobia when the whole thing is caused by the military and foreign policies of the West.
Thank you for that, Mark. And I just want to bring in Mr. Chowdhury at this point because the Times here telling us that his hate videos are still available on YouTube. Well, that's very interesting. But of course, he's now been put into a British prison. And we should make the point that it's been, this was pointed out by the BBC back in April 2015, that various people have been warning about Islamic radicalization in English prisons for a number of years now. And so what do? They make sure that they're... Well, Chowdhury has never quite gotten rid of the allegations that he is an MI5 asset over the years. It's never really been proven. It's never been disproven either. And certainly there seems to be stuff in his background which suggests that he is in fact working for the intelligence agency. So they've put him in prison. What's he going to do while he's there, Brian?
I think he's going to radicalise people. If whatever he is, he's got a captive audience. And I think there are also plans for sort of Muslim-only prisons, which will further help matters degenerate. Well, with an eye on the clock, let's just move on a bit. We're very pleased to announce that 21 days and still a wall of silence from Policing Minister B. Lewis. So this is the man who simply does not want to respond to the statement of the Met policeman whistleblower. 21 days of total silence from the policing minister after a testimony is put forward talking about high-level cover-up of child abuse, including children found dead in the gutter. And here we have this Conservative minister doesn't want to reply. But he's not alone. That's the good thing, because we got the former policing minister, Mike Penning, and it's 21 days for him as well. I had a little conversation with some of his Conservative Association senior team this morning. I think he's been on holiday, so maybe he's had a couple of points while he was there. But don't worry about the children in the gutter. And then the BBC, totally unaware of the whistleblower, but apparently police whistleblowers have come forward telling the BBC that overtime's going to be cut. So good to see our Parliament and the BBC. They got their priorities right. It's war, more war, beer and holidays. Is the BBC covering up state-sponsored child abusers using public money? I asked the question, but I'm happy to say I'm sure they are. Well, let's end on some good news. And a few people in the chat box were ahead of the game here because Nicola Sturgeon's coming under huge pressure. She's being savaged over the named person scheme. Please read this Express article because there's a great deal of information in it about a father who was prevented from seeing his little baby daughter. They even changed her name, falsified records. He says, I've been treated like a criminal for having the best interests of my child at heart. And here's the gentleman. All sorts of dirty dealing. His name's on the birth certificate, but we're learning from informed sources in Scotland that, of course, that does not matter under Scottish law. We'll report more on that in due course. There he is. He's been treated like a criminal. But he says there's no such thing as a named person, only a state-run body that is making the rules up as they go along. So this man is spot on the money. Nicola Sturgeon should be ashamed and Mr. Alexander should be considering his position. Well, neither of them will do that because they're not ashamed. He says there's numerous laws being broken. I've been subjected to horrendous treatment, and yet the council's response is a basic dereliction of duty. Laws broken, dereliction of duty, lies, children's records falsified. This is life in the new SNP fiefdom, Mike.
Well, the problem is that people don't realise that the relationship between themselves and their elected representatives has been changed. So they think that councils and MPs should behave in one way, whereas councils and MPs believe that they should behave in another way, and the two don't match. So there's a misunderstanding.
Which people should investigate themselves. Well, let's add a bit more, because the news is even worse for Nicola Sturgeon, and that is her dad has been unable to get himself elected. Now, if you look at this is the Sturgeon family team. So this is Nicola and Mummy and Daddy, and clearly they've been working to build up a little fiefdom. But Robin Sturgeon lost in the Irvine West by-election. Joan Sturgeon, the mother, is an Irvine councillor and provost, but bad news because Labour has secured the majority, so SNP being pushed to one side in quite a sustained public backlash. Let's remember that Nicola Sturgeon's husband is also the chief executive of SNP, so this is a very cosy little fiefdom going on here, Mike.
Family enterprise.
Family enterprise, and if they want to take your children, as the Dohertys have shown, they just come along and take the children. Let's bring in this one here. This is a good headline: humiliation for Sturgeon as her mother quits the council role amid growing fury. So here we are, growing mistrust in SNP. And we'll just say, Mark, is the news of the demise of Nicola Sturgeon hitting America yet? She hasn't visited Obama. She's been over to try and visit the great and good in Berlin, but she was only given a very junior minister whom she bowed to. I don't know whether she's been sitting on Obama's knee at all.
I'm not aware of that being much of a story here in the States. No, sir. I'm not very familiar with the Sturgeons. Certainly I'll read up on them, but they haven't done much in the way of making headlines here.
Well, just as well, but we'll continue to keep you posted. Do you want to end on finance very quickly, Mike? Just a word for the sake of money.
Yes,
and the love of money, of course.
Yes, just another bank losing a load of money. £177 million lost by the cooperative bank this past year. But it's all right because that was £27 million less than they lost last year. So no problems there.
Great.
So that's it.
Okay, Mark, we give you 30 seconds for anything you like on close.
Well, if you and I lost so much as $50, if we were in a sensitive job, we'd be in a straitjacket somewhere in a padded cell with no windows and only bread and water. So 177 million, what's a few million, you know? I guess I'll end on that humorous note, but I think we've covered a lot of important things today. I'm going to be continuing to follow Hillary Clinton's health, mental, physical, and otherwise, and some very interesting developments in terms of congressional candidates, a little bit more on Bilderberg, a number of things with the think tanks and the progress of these big trade treaties, and whether the Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to be voted on by Congress this calendar year or after the elections, things like that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We will end by saying a big thank you to all of our supporters who attended the George meeting last night. It was wonderful to see you all. Thank you all to the Cornish contingent who always travel some miles in order to come and see us. And thank you for the purchases of UK Column T-shirts. Of course, you can still order one of those through the UK Column website. We've also uncovered a batch of old but usable bumper stickers, which we're going to make available because they're better out there than in our cupboard. But more details on that in due course. But thank you to everyone supporting us at the moment. Stay with us. We'll be back same time tomorrow.
With Alex Thompson.
With Alex Thompson. Sorry, I'm stuttering there because I've forgotten what day of the week it is, but you're quite right, Mike. Yeah. Okay, so stay with us and for Alex Thompson tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.